never thought that sharing an apartment would lead to a living nightmare. My name is Evelyn, and I was thrilled when I found an affordable apartment in a quaint part of the city. The place was small but comfortable, a modest living room, a functional kitchen, and a bedroom that promised rest after long days. I was also relieved to have a roommate, Marcus, who appeared quiet and respectful. But as the weeks went by, little things began to unsettle me. At first, it was the sound of soft footsteps when I was alone, and small objects inexplicably moved from their usual spots. I brushed these off as quirks of the building or my own tired imagination. However, Marcus's behavior gradually grew more peculiar. He was unusually protective of his personal belongings, rarely inviting anyone near his private storage area. He'd often make vague excuses and change the subject whenever I casually asked about it. I began to feel an inexplicable dread when he was around, as if he harbored secrets too heavy to share. One chilly evening, after a long day at work, I returned early and decided to tidy up the living room. As I straightened a stack of old magazines on the bookshelf, something shiny caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a mislaid key or coin, but on closer inspection, I saw a small camera tucked behind the books. My heart hammered as I realized that this was no accident. It was a hidden camera, purposefully placed to monitor the living room. In that moment, the friendly facade of my roommate crumbled, revealing an invasive breach of my privacy I could never have imagined. For hours, I sat in the darkened room, paralyzed by shock and disbelief. Questions raced through my mind. When had he installed it? How long had I been watched? The thought that every mundane activity, from making coffee in the morning to relaxing on the couch, had been recorded filled me with an all-consuming fear. I resolved to gather evidence, meticulously combing through our shared spaces for any other signs of surveillance. The unsettling feeling that I was being observed turned each passing moment into an ordeal. In the following days, I meticulously documented every unusual occurrence. I noted how Marcus would suddenly vanish when I entered a room, and how I always found my personal items slightly out of place. I even began noticing the faint whir of what I assumed were additional hidden devices lurking somewhere in our apartment. The sense of vulnerability was overwhelming, and my once safe home morphed into a place of constant dread. Unable to bear the daily invasion of my privacy any longer, I confronted Marcus one evening. I approached him with a trembling voice and a heavy heart, asking directly about the camera. At first, he tried to deny any wrongdoing, insisting that it must have been installed by a previous tenant or was part of an old security system. But as I pressed him with the evidence I had gathered, his facade began to crack. In a hushed tone, he admitted that he'd installed the device to keep track of things, an excuse that fell flat against the gravity of his actions. He confessed that his troubled past had instilled in him a desperate need for control, a need that had twisted into a fixation on surveillance. The conversation left me shaken to my core. I felt betrayed and violated, my trust shattered by someone I had once considered a friend. I immediately contacted the police, handing over the recordings and all the evidence I had collected. The investigation that followed unearthed a troubling pattern in Marcus's history, one of manipulation and intrusive behavior that had invaded his previous living situations as well. Though the police took swift action, the damage was done. My sense of safety was irreparably compromised. Now, months later, I still struggle with the lingering effects of that experience. Every creak in the apartment, every flicker of a light, transports me back to those days of uncertainty and terror. I've since moved out, but the psychological scars remain, etched into my memory like a constant reminder of how easily privacy can be stolen. I try to rebuild my life, yet the fear that someone somewhere might be watching continues to haunt me. Some nights, when the world is quiet and the darkness feels too heavy, I can almost hear the faint hum of hidden devices and the silent whispers of a past I cannot escape. The knowledge that every intimate moment of my life was once observed, without my consent, leaves me unsettled. I often wonder how many others have experienced such betrayal in the guise of companionship. Even as I attempt to trust again, a part of me remains forever vigilant, a silent guardian against the possibility that my next sanctuary might harbor hidden eyes in the shadows. That experience lingers as a stark reminder. Betrayal often hides behind the warmest smiles. My name is Jason, and I used to believe that moving in with a roommate would be an opportunity to build a friendly, supportive life. I recently moved into a modest apartment in a quiet part of town, excited to share expenses and laughter with my new roommate Alan, who was a recent college grad like me. At first, Alan's reserved demeanor and thoughtful comments made him seem like the perfect housemate, but it wasn't long before a creeping unease began to take hold. In the early weeks, I noticed small things that didn't add up. Every time I made a decision, whether it was decorating my room with new posters or choosing a particular brand of coffee, Alan would offer unsolicited criticism. "That color doesn't suit you," he remarked once when I hung a bright abstract painting on my wall, his tone dismissive and cold. Initially, I chalked it up to simple differences in taste, thinking perhaps he was just trying to help. But his comments grew more frequent and harsher with each passing day. It wasn't only about aesthetics. I soon realized that Alan's critique extended to every facet of my daily life. When I prepared dinner, he would comment on my choice of ingredients, and even the way I arranged the table. If I invited friends over, he made pointed remarks about how I interacted with them, as if scrutinizing every word I spoke. His words, seemingly minor at first, began to erode my confidence in ways I never anticipated. The atmosphere in our apartment shifted subtly, but undeniably. I began to feel that every move I made was being evaluated, every decision dissected. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear Alan's soft murmurs in the hallway, almost as if he were rehearsing a critique before delivering it the next day. I started questioning whether my own thoughts were valid or if they were just targets for his relentless judgment. That creeping doubt seeped into every corner of my mind, turning my once comforting home into a place of anxiety and self-doubt. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, I returned home hoping for a moment of peace. Instead, I found Alan waiting in the living room with an unreadable expression. "You really think your choices are the best, don't you?" he said, his voice low and devoid of any warmth. The words struck me like a blow, leaving me momentarily speechless. His tone was not merely critical, it was methodical, as if each word were carefully calculated to chip away at my sense of self-worth. In that moment, I realized that what I had dismissed as harmless opinion was something far more invasive. The tension reached its peak over the following weeks. I began to document every comment, every snide remark, hoping to understand the pattern behind Alan's behavior. The recordings revealed that his criticism was not random, but a relentless, calculated assault on my confidence. I found myself second-guessing every decision, every minor preference, until I could barely recognize the person I once was. The shared apartment had transformed into a battleground where my every move was scrutinized, leaving me isolated and deeply anxious. Desperate for clarity, I confronted Alan one night. My voice shook as I demanded to know why he felt the need to constantly tear me down. For a long moment, the room was silent, the weight of his gaze pressing down on me. Then, in a barely audible whisper, he confessed that his behavior was rooted in a past filled with rejection and loss. He explained that in his previous life, control was the only way to shield himself from chaos. Though his words were laced with pain, they did little to soothe the damage he had inflicted upon me. Instead, they revealed a disturbing willingness to manipulate others as a means of coping with his own demons. In the days that followed, the emotional toll became unbearable. I withdrew from friends and family, haunted by the constant barrage of criticisms that echoed in my mind. Therapy became my refuge, a space where I could slowly begin to reclaim my identity. Yet, even as I learned to stand up for myself, I couldn't shake the lingering feeling of being watched, judged, and ultimately diminished. Now, as I sit in my new apartment, far away from that toxic environment, I still feel the residue of those harrowing months. The memories of Alan's dispassionate critiques and the pervasive atmosphere of judgment continue to haunt me. I often wonder how someone can use words as weapons, reducing another person to a collection of flaws and mistakes. Even in quiet moments when the world seems to fall silent, I can almost hear the echo of his voice, a constant reminder of the vulnerability that once consumed me. Some nights, as I lie awake, I wonder if I can ever escape the shadow of his relentless words. The memory of that constant judgment haunts me still, a silent warning forever. I remember the day I moved into my new apartment. I was filled with hope and excitement about finally living on my own. The building was modest, with a few floors and a worn, comfortable charm that promised simplicity and freedom. I was looking forward to a fresh start. Soon after settling in, I met my roommate Derek. At first, his charm and confidence were a welcome presence. He had a way of making everyday tasks seem effortless, and he quickly assumed the role of someone who knew what he was doing, especially when it came to managing our shared expenses. Initially, our arrangement was straightforward. We agreed to split rent and bills equally, and everything seemed perfectly balanced. But in the weeks that followed, small, unsettling details began to emerge. Derek started suggesting that certain expenses should be handled his way. At first, his suggestions seemed helpful, but gradually they became intrusive. He insisted on managing our joint bank account, telling me that he could secure us against any unforeseen issues. I felt uneasy, but his confident manner and the promise of financial stability made it hard to object. It wasn't long before I noticed discrepancies in our account. A few days after setting up our shared finances, I saw a transaction labeled necessary maintenance that I didn't recall approving. I mentioned it casually, and Derek dismissed my concerns with a calm smile, saying it was routine and nothing to worry about. However, as days turned into weeks, more transactions appeared, small amounts deducted regularly for expenses that were never clearly explained. I began to feel that something was off. Each time I questioned him, he offered elaborate justifications that made it seem as though I was overreacting. Late one evening, when the apartment was cloaked in quiet, and the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator, I sat down to review my finances in detail. That's when I discovered the truth. My savings were inexplicably dwindling, and every deduction pointed back to Derek's hidden transfers. A deep sense of violation washed over me. It felt as if someone I trusted had been silently undermining my financial independence, taking control over money that was rightfully mine. Over the next several days, my home transformed from a sanctuary into a place of constant unease. I began noticing that Derek's behavior grew increasingly controlling. He spent long hours poring over bank statements, his eyes fixated on figures as if they were the key to some dark secret. At night, I distinctly heard the soft click of a calculator and the shuffle of papers. It was as though the very walls were whispering that nothing was as it seemed. The feeling of being watched and manipulated grew with each passing day until I could no longer ignore the creeping dread in the pit of my stomach. The breaking point came one rainy evening when, after another unexplained withdrawal from our account, I confronted him. I laid out all the evidence I had gathered, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. His initial reaction was defensive. He tried to claim that every expense was necessary, insisting he was protecting us from future problems. But as I pressed him further, his calm facade began to crumble. In a low, remorseful tone, he admitted that he had been transferring funds without my permission, rationalizing his actions as measures taken to safeguard our financial future. His explanation was disturbingly clinical, as if he had planned every move with meticulous precision. That night, I felt utterly betrayed and exposed. The person I once trusted had invaded my privacy and undermined my independence. I immediately contacted the authorities, and an investigation soon followed. Even as the police took statements and began unraveling Derek's history of similar behavior, the damage to my sense of security was irreversible. Now, months later, I still struggle with the aftermath. The apartment, once a symbol of hope and freedom, has become a silent reminder of that betrayal. Even in the quiet moments, I cannot escape the feeling that my life was dismantled piece by someone I once believed had my best interests at heart. I question not only my financial independence, but also my judgment in trusting another person with something as personal as my livelihood. In the silence of my new home, I remain vigilant and haunted by the memories, forever wary of the subtle ways in which trust can be exploited and autonomy eroded.